Aloha, everyone. Again, we are very excited to have Dr. Ron Williams with us for our third session related to the church and the development from the beginnings of the mission to the development of the church as we know it. What's exciting is the fact that we're listening to and looking at original documents that from that time that were written in the Hawaiian language and that we've not had access to before. And so we're very grateful to Dr. Williams for the work he has done in translating those documents so that we hear Hawaii's history from the voice of the Hawaiian people. And now I am very happy to welcome Kahumanu Naiole from Kamehameha Schools, Bishop Memorial Chapel, and Kalihi and Moanalua Church, and ask him to pule for us to open our session.
Mahalo, aloha pumeana kako. Let us pray. E pule kako. Kia kua manaloa, mahalo iāoi no ke ala e hoʻonani kako I ko inoa e molele. Lord, we thank you for this day. We give praises to your holy name. Lord, we pray for this time together. May it be a time that educates us, that uplifts us, that challenges us, that makes us ask hard questions of ourselves, of one another. But also, Lord, that this be a quest to help us to seek truth, to help us to seek your truth. Lord, and that we can be just good caretakers and good cultivators of that truth. And may it help us to be more loving, be more kind, be more gracious, be more gentle, be all the things that you have called us to be. Lord, we're so grateful for Dr. Williams and for his time with us. And we pray that you instill within this inspiration and knowledge and wisdom in all that he has in store for us today. Lord, we thank you for all your blessings. Amen.
Okay, aloha mai kako. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to set up my camera here. Just for those folks who are joining us for the first week, I want to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Ronald Williams Jr. My father is Ron Williams Sr. He lives in Arkansas. He's a hunter, a fisherman, a farmer. His family comes from Arkansas way back, and our farmers, a long line of farmers. My mother is Janet Marie LaBounty. She comes from Chicago, Illinois, where I was born. Her people come back from Montreal, Canada, and before that, Ireland, France, Wales, England, and Czechoslovakia. So that's who I am. Who I am academically is I have a PhD in Hawaiian history with a focus on Hawaiian language, native language sources. And I've done my dissertation and hopefully forthcoming book on the churches in Hawaii. So most of you have been with us, so you know where we are, but just to refresh everyone else's thinking. We left off last week after week 2. It just passed the Bayonet Constitution. We had shown a printer's draft of the Bayonet Constitution and talked about the Hawaiian League, the all-white secret group that had gathered together to push back against the native monarchs and to seek control of Hawaii, a kind of a bastardization of their original mission, right? Many of these mission sons had acquired some land, acquired property and so forth, and now fell guilty to that enticement from greed and things like that. So we talked about that quite a bit with primary source documents. Today, we're going to move forward from there. And yes, talk about the overthrow, but more importantly, talk about Christian examples from the different sides, if you want to call them, and ask ourselves throughout this next 45 minutes, what was that Christian mission? How did it change, if it did? And are these folks acting in the way they were supposed to be acting? If they weren't, then that means there's a legacy for us to look back on and figure out if there's something we need to do about it, right? All those who are Christian, I think, have the responsibility to live a bit of a higher standard life. And so we'll look through these documents and kind of evaluate them. Some of them are very difficult to look through and to hear about. And some of them, folks might say, well, they're 200 years old. But as we were talking briefly before the start, this history Hasamoʻo Kūʻauhau has a genealogy that lands square dab in Hawaii today, Hawaiʻi. Most of the people you know, most of the people around Hawaii have been touched in one way or another by this history. So we do need to take it seriously. Okay, so that's that. I want to start off by answering a question that I wasn't able to answer last week. I couldn't think of them off the top of my head, but someone had asked me who the first 4 ordained pastors were. So I pulled that up. In 1820, the missionaries arrived. By 1863, they had ordained only 4 native pastors. 2 of those were pastors that were sent to Micronesia as pastors. They were James Kakela and Samuel Aloha. 2 of the pastors were 2 native pastors were ordained to serve here in the Hawaiian Islands, and that was Stephen Waimalu in 1850 and David Malo in 1852. So from 1820 to 1850, there were only 2 native pastors ordained, and those were sent to Micronesia. But in 1850, Waimalu was ordained. In 1852, David Malo was ordained. Right. So we had 4 native pastors by 1862. I mentioned in the first talk, and if somebody has a question about it, I'd be happy to go into it further afterwards. But after Rufus Anderson comes and pushes them to form a native pastorship, there is a school opened in Honolulu called the North Pacific Missionary Institute. And that's where native pastors were trained. Most of them, probably 95% of them that ended up going into pulpits after the 1870s came through that school in Honolulu. So if you're interested in that, let me know afterwards. Okay. So the American Protestant mission to the Hawaiian Islands. Part 3, Poʻe Karitiano ʻOiaʻiʻo. I came across this title and this, chapter title from their letters, from the letters of Native Hawaiian Christians. When we have in the past given Kanaka Oiwi credit for the diplomatic accomplishments they did, we've given them credit for becoming one of the most literate nations in the world within 3 decades. What's to stop us from understanding that they took a religion that was foreign to them, ingested it, studied it, and understood it very, very well in that same time period? There are all kinds of stories of native Christian leaders in the islands who were doing analytical tracks on the Bible and so forth. And we'll talk about one of those gentlemen later. So it wasn't something they were that stayed foreign to them, and it wasn't something that they weren't able to dive into deeply and really engage with. Yeah. So they end up calling in their letters, a lot of their letters post-bayonet, when the nation is beginning to be taken from them by their white Christian leaders, they start to call those guys and say they're apostates, and they say we're the true Poʻe Karitiano ʻOiaʻiʻo, yeah, true Christians. Okay, post-bayonet. So bayonet refers to the bayonet constitution. The 2-minute version, if you missed last week, the Hawaiian League, an all-white secret group of men gathered together into a league, many of them the leaders of the white Christian church in Hawaii. They drafted a new constitution to take the power away from the king. They incorporated the Honolulu Rifles, which was a private militia, to back them up. And they went to the king and said, sign this or we'll kill you and take over. The king signed, so he remained mo'i to many of their consternations. But that's what happened in July of 1887. We talked about how it disenfranchised all Asian voters, how it disenfranchised many Native Hawaiians and others because it raised an income clause higher. And we talked about how it enfranchised any white residents of Hawaii. If you were a resident, you didn't have to be a subject, you didn't have to be a citizen, you just had to be living here. And if you were white, then you could vote. So we really start to see a very specific and blatant attempt to push white power in Hawaii. And still at that point, a very minority power. You're talking about 3 or 4% of the population. Okay, so post-bayonet, how did Kanaka Oiwi Christians react to that? Well, the first thing they did was start ʻAhahui ʻAina Hawaii, the first Native Hawaiian political party in the islands. So they had always been voting, they had always been engaged in politics. Bayonet really struck them as somebody just basically that was a coup, right? You took over the government almost. You robbed the executive of much of the power and put it into the legislature and then fixed the legislature. So they started a political party to engage in that venue, among others, to push back and to resist. And so ʻAhahui Kalākaua Hawaii is started. It started mostly within the churches. One of the main churches it came to birth in was Kaumakapili Church in downtown Honolulu. And they come together and say, we're going to, electioneer, we're going to, send in petitions, we're going to do all these things to engage more fully in politics. They also sent in petitions. Palapala hoʻopiʻi are petitions. Some really interesting facts about Hawaiian Kingdom petitions in the late 19th century. When a group of folks in a given town got together and drafted a petition and sent it into they would give it to their local legislator. That legislator would introduce it into the Hawaiian Kingdom legislature. And by law, every petition had to be heard. Every petition had to go to a committee, whenever committee was appropriate. They would talk about the petition, hear it out, draft a thing. They would draft a opinion on it, and then it would go to the full legislature. Now sometimes they were able to vote unanimously to say this one's so ridiculous we're not going to even bring it to the legislature. But the point is, the people had a voice in the legislature. If you send an email to the governor of Hawaii today, I wonder myself how much that has an effect on it. But in the kingdom, they literally had to address all of these issues. So Hawaiians start to use that venue, another originally foreign venue, to engage in a discussion with their mo'i and their legislators. To mo'i Kalākaua in 1890 and 1892, especially in 1892, Hui Kalākaua starts to send him petitions and deliver him petitions physically at the palace saying we need a new constitution. This constitution is absolutely absurd. We need a new constitution. When the Queen Liliuokalani comes to power in 1891, one of the first things she does is take a traditional circuit of the islands, and at every stop, they bring her physical, literal petitions. We have those at the State Archives. We have about 6,000 signatures on petitions demanding a new constitution from her. So on a side note, for those folks that when you hear the fact that, well, one of the reasons they overthrew the Queen was because she was trying to grab power and it was all, an ego ploy and so forth, her people demanded of her a new constitution. She was listening to the voters of her constituents. So they petitioned her at that point, and they also petitioned the legislature. I have gone through with the 1892 legislature, which is the second one after bayonet, and pulled all the petitions that had to do with constitutions, the new constitution in it. And I came up, there's an example of one of them, the originals. There were 56 petitions submitted to the 1892 legislature demanding a new constitution for the Kingdom of Hawaii, with a total of 4,347 signatures. That might not seem like a ton compared to today when you see on Facebook, this one got 100,000 and so forth, but 4,000 voters, registered voters, was about 25% of the voting population. So you start to see these come in again from churches, from communities around the kingdom. And this is one of many. So you have this tug of war going, this push and pull going between the white Christian leadership in Hawaii and some others, and the monarchy. And it's mostly economic. You see the sugar growers pushing for different things they want to see the king do in his relationship with America and different countries and so forth. And so that kind of is this, again, this push and pull. After bayonet, when the white Christian leadership sees the fact that Hawaiians have organized a political party, are pushing back, are demanding things of their mo'i through petitions, they start to re-engage also, kind of pushing back. And we'll see here, I've created a little small list. Following the 17 January 1893 coup that removed the Queen from the throne, the white Christian leadership in Hawaii, brazen, hungry for power, and fearful of the consequences of their treasonous actions if their plan failed, manipulated, lied, and attacked Queen Liliuokalani from the pulpits, newspapers, meeting halls, and back rooms in both Hawaii and America. Now that may sound a little aggressive, it may sound kind of harsh, it underplays the record. I'm going to show you, we've got 45 minutes today, I'm going to show you a dozen maybe examples. There are literally thousands of examples of these men who were many of who are ministers, who are engaging in subterfuge, engaging in lying, engaging in promoting the theft of a nation from its people, all of these types of things. And it's happening here in Hawaii, and they're also sending folks to Washington, D.C. Reverend Olison went to D.C. Reverend Oliver Pomeroy Emerson went to DC to really start to kind of be one of those voices for that white minority community in Hawaii. You see some of the names there. William Brewster Olison, he was the first principal at Kamehameha Schools. William DeWitt Alexander and Baldwin's son, Reverend Emerson, Sanford Dole. All these gentlemen were officers in either the ʻAhahui o Hawaii, the Hawaiian Evangelical Association, or that new group they had founded to remissionize Hawaii that was only white. They're officers in either one of these groups. Okay. So we're going to look at a couple of them and a couple of their actions. So on the first Sunday after the overthrow, my camera's a little weird, but okay. On the first Sunday after the overthrow, I think it was the 22nd, Reverend Thomas Gulick preached a sermon from Central Union Church pulpit. And if you don't know, Central Union Church originally wasn't where it is now. It was literally across the street from Washington Place. It was in the Mauka corner of the state capitol lawn, right? So it was literally across the street from Washington Place where the Queen lived. And on that first Sunday after the overthrow, Thomas Gulick preached a sermon called The Evils of Monarchy. And he talks about how when you raise a woman up to a certain height and you give her power without question, she turns bad and so forth. And it played on rumors that others weren't said from the pulpit, but were common rumors around town that you see folks pushing back against in the newspapers and so forth, that the Queen was doing witchcraft, that she was having orgies at the palace, all these types of things that these types of sermons are playing on and saying, you know, we're not going to stoop that low, but we're going to play on that to tell you that monarchy itself is an evil thing. There's the actual paper over there. And one of the interesting parts about it is, not only was it preached from the pulpit, he requested that it be published in the newspapers. So it came out in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, and it came out in the Hawaiian Gazette. We're going to talk about those two papers in a little bit. Both purchased in 1888, so the year after Bayonet, by William Richards Castle. So the vice president of the ʻAhahui o Hawaii, the vice president of basically the new Hawaiian mission, purchases both the major English language papers in town to put into their things like this and other political things. So on the flip side, you have these men preaching against the Queen across from her house, literally on that day, and then she obviously, you know, receives the papers. She writes in her diary a diary entry on February 5th, 1893, where she says this: "I never saw a more unchristian-like set as these missionaries, and so uncharitable as to abuse me in the manner they do from the pulpit." And let me give you her entire, I have it in my other piece over here. Okay, so this is her actual diary, the entry page for February 2nd. Washington Place. "It's a gloomy day and it rains, rains, rains. Do not feel like going to church. Perhaps never more. I never saw a more unchristian-like set as these missionaries, and so uncharitable as to abuse me in the manner they do from the pulpit. Is it godly? It makes me feel as if I would not like to do anything more for churches, etc., etc." Now we know that this was a temporary feeling of hers. We know this was her feeling low and being brought down by that, because we know almost immediately she resumed her work with the churches. We know that she was baptized Anglican. So she was kind of finally leaving that church that raised her because of their actions, but she remained and kind of increased her belief in God and her staunch Christianity. But it speaks to that idea of how, you know, that identity as Christian. Okay, so now we're going to focus on a couple of different men who were kind of prominent in that arena of kind of turning their back on their mission and turning their back, I would say, on Christianity and doing what they needed to do under the guise of Christianity to gain power. And one of those was the Reverend Sereno Edwards Bishop. He took over the Friend, which was the mission newspaper. So the mission put out the Friend once a month. We spoke about this last week. Originally, it was run by Samuel Damon. It was mostly about shipping churches, of course, church news and so forth. but very seldom dabbled into politics. Well, that all changed the month of the overthrow, because the next month, Sereno Bishop became the editor of the paper, and he started to write prolifically in the paper about political issues, using Christianity as a weapon against the Queen and against the people. This is one article. So this is the issue that comes out, the first issue that comes out after the overthrow. And he titles his first article, "A Wonderful Week." And he says, "It was a history-making epoch, witnessing the unheralded and shameful collapse of the once noble and proud Hawaiian monarchy, and initiating, as we believe, a glorious new era of freedom and honor for Hawaii. At once sprang forth the wrath and power of the conservative and long-suffering whites. Our noble citizens of America and European blood have once more paid homage and devotion to the lofty cause of liberty and progress. And our gracious God has once more, with a peculiar care and protection, blessed and smiled upon this young and favored nation of Hawaii." So he's really claiming God there, right? He's saying God is the one behind this plan of ours, this white supremacy, taking over Hawaii, bringing in supposedly progress and liberty and all of these types of things. When we've seen the record, it's almost the opposite. They're bringing in a minority oligarchy to run the country. They're bringing in a group of 2,000 to 3,000 white folks to run a country of 130,000 brown folk. Yeah. So that's the first one of the articles that he writes immediately after the overthrow. William DeWitt Alexander was another. Alexander was a mission son. He was also two-time president of the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society. He was an annexation commissioner to the US, probably the most prolific writer on Hawaiian history of that era. He was the guy people went to document history and to kind of get it set for the future. He writes a book called A Brief History of the Hawaiian People. I've got a copy myself, but I don't have it in front of me. And this is a book that comes out of his pamphlet that he wrote for the overthrow. He wrote a pamphlet to justify the overthrow, and it was called The Revolution, right? It's not a coup, it's not a overthrow. He says it's the revolution, and he says it was done for these different reasons. He writes about how the evilness of the reign of Kalākaua started with the reign of Kamehameha, and he ties this whole thing to the fact that monarchy has always been corrupt and so forth. But when he finishes that pamphlet in '93, later in '98 and '99, they ask him to turn it into a book. And this is the actual book. It's called A Brief History of the Hawaiian People. And it's a horrific book. It talks about how Hawaiians aren't qualified to lead the country. It talks about the evils of the past and so forth. It was published by order of the Board of Education in Hawaii, which he's the president of. And it was printed by the American Book Company in New York. So he says in it, the evils of Kalakaua's reign begin with the reigns of Kamehameha. He talks about infanticide in the book. And if you've seen me talk before, you've probably seen this before, but I want to make sure everyone's aware. Dr. David Stannard, Dr. Trask's husband, had written a book called The Myth of Infanticide about 10 years ago, 15 years ago now, with a deeply researched book that showed that it wasn't a general practice in Hawaii, that that was a rumor, that there really was zero evidence that there was a significant practice in Hawaii at all. Nonetheless, in this book, published by W.D. Alexander, he says that 2/3, he says those best informed tell us that 2/3 of all Native children were buried alive, most often in their front yards by their unnatural parents. And he said the reason given for it was laziness, unwillingness to raise children. So he says 2/3 of Hawaiian children were buried alive because their parents were too lazy to raise them. Now we know that's ridiculous. We know that's kind of this racist, outrageous statement. But the reason why it's important, the reason why I'm telling you about it today is because that book becomes an incredibly important book in the education of future Hawaiians. They say it is very necessary to have a work of this kind in the hands of the higher classes in our schools. And the book becomes this textbook for all territorial schools in Hawaii, public and private, for 40 years. For 40 years. So from 1899 to 1939, if you went to school in Hawaii, this was your book that you learned history from. And it said that Hawaiians killed 2/3 of their babies because they didn't feel like raising them. That's how you start to turn a people that have a long history of pride, have a long history of knowledge of accomplishment, into what we end up in the 1940s and 50s, which is the identity of a Hawaiian as not so good and lazy and not so smart and so forth. You erase that entire past by over generations getting stuff into the institutional curriculum like this. So that becomes, again, that becomes the book for 40 years in all public and private schools. It also became the school textbook on Hawaii at Leland Stanford University. So it's going to be moving forward from 1900, the book that Americans learn their history about Hawaii from. Okay. Going back to Reverend Bishop for a moment. Reverend Bishop gets hired in 1893. We mentioned this briefly last week, but I want to dab into it a little more here. In 1894, in January, Reverend Edward Sereno Bishop has a meeting with the UPI, the United Press International, and it's the wire service, just like it is today. There can't be, newspapers can't afford to have a reporter in every city in the world. So independent reporters will work in cities and then put their stuff up on, quote, the wire, and any newspaper can use it. Well, so Reverend Sereno Bishop at that meeting was hired as the UP correspondent for Honolulu. So most of the news coming out of Hawaii during this overthrow, coming up on annexation, all these different issues, is going to be coming from Reverend Sereno Edwards Bishop. And he writes these columns. Again, we've talked about this before. How do you get... So he writes these columns that appear in newspapers in New York and Montreal, or in Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, all across the East Coast. And again, understand the position they were in. They were not in a position of power. They were a tiny minority. And they're trying to convince the United States to go against its morals. They're trying to convince the United States that there shouldn't be democracy in Hawaii. So the only argument they have is this incredibly racist argument that, well, even though we've said they were Christian 40 years ago, they're not really Christian and they're not really human. And so he writes these columns called Race Supremacy, Trouble from Native Ignorance, Annexation is the Thing Desired, The Character of the Opposition, Lil and the Japs, Interesting Gossip about King Kalākaua's Widow, right? And one of the really important things to understand also is he's writing these as a Congregationalist minister. And so he knows that he shouldn't be doing this. And so he writes under a pseudonym. And so he writes until 1902 under the pseudonym, and then finally in 1902 in July, he comes out and says in his final column who he is, and he reveals it. So in a series of over 100 columns published in newspapers across the United States, the Reverend Sereno Edwards Bishop updated an American audience to affairs in Hawaii as the Honolulu AP correspondent Kamehameha, right? He took the name Kamehameha, the most sacred name Hawaiians have, to write columns saying they weren't qualified to vote, to write columns saying they couldn't keep up with the white kids in school, and so forth and so forth. So there's that extra kind of personalized attack, again, coming from a Congregationalist minister. So that's Sereno's there. I want to point out one in particular that he writes before we move on. When the Queen was in Washington, D.C., and she was fighting for the kingdom lands and the crown still, again, she's making that argument that, hey, America, just live up to your creed. Just understand that we are a nation. You said so. We don't want to be annexed. And so he's, again, got a difficult position to be in to argue against that. And so he writes this column. He says, this takes us back to the point first made. So they've been making the argument, the Queen and so forth have been making the argument that people should vote, that Hawaiians should vote on annexation, because they know if they do, it would be hugely defeated. But she says, he says, this takes us back to the point first made, that the people of Hawaii must be a party to the contract for annexation. Here is the very question to be settled. Who are the real people of Hawaii? Are they the decadent and dwindling race of Aboriginal Hawaiians who still linger in the land, a feeble and inefficient people, pushed aside from active life by the swarming Asiatics and the vigorous whites? Or are they not rather the fresh, active, brainy white race who have by their skill and energy created the great wealth and thriving commerce of these islands, who own what they have thus created, and who are manifestly the heirs of the future of Hawaii, rather than the weak native race? Whites must govern. By reason of their superior capacity and force, the whites of Hawaii have become the real people of Hawaii. Signed, Kamehameha, right? So he's making this absurd argument that Hawaiians aren't even Hawaiian anymore. If you want Hawaiians to vote on this issue, then the Mission Sons will vote on it, right? So that's how far he's come. And again, outside of the historical realm, when we're looking at this and judging this, again, from the Christian realm, and we start to have questions about his actions, right? He was also quite a egotist. He kept all of his columns in a book that I discovered at the Hawaiian Mission Houses Museum about a decade ago. And I think one of the most powerful pieces of evidence I found in all of this research was that this Congregationalist minister wrote to his best friend in Boston later and talked about the Kamehameha letters, the letters that he'd been writing. And he said this: I do not reckon the Kamehameha letters as a work in which I shall particularly rejoice in the future life, although I hope they have done some service in a good cause, right? So very clearly here, you know, I've pitched aside all of my moral, you know, issues, and I just hope it's done us some good. I hope we're taking over the country. You know, I may be going to hell, but the political gain is won. And that's, now he may be one of the most strident, one of the most kind of at the end of the timeline guys, but that's the story of 1863 on, that mission that they had brought in 1820 to deliver the gospel of Christ to Hawaii has been completely bastardized by this point. So really quickly, when we talk about the churches and how they reacted, the day after the overthrow of the Queen, the trustees at Waine'e Church in Lahaina, Keopuolani's church, called together a prayer fast meeting, and they prayed for the restoration of the Queen and the independence of the nation. The pastor, Reverend Adam Pali, had decided to, I don't know whether it was to keep his job or he really believed in it, but he decided to go with his administration and push against the Queen and preach anti-monarchical rhetoric from the pulpit and preach pro-annexation and so forth. And the congregation wasn't having it. And so they called a meeting in May of 1893, and 83 of 87 members of the church voted, signed this petition and voted to oust him as their pastor. Now they had the power to do that because they were incorporated, and by law, the congregation decides who the pastor is. So they vote out the pastor. Reverend Adam Pali writes to Albert Francis Judd, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and also the president of ʻAhahui Hawaii. So he's the president of the churches. And those letters are in Hawaiian. They're in the Judd archives at Bishop Museum. And like Adam Pali, many pastors are doing this, but Pali writes in and says, you got to help me. And so Chief Justice Judd sends a committee of two to Maui, and they hold a meeting by themselves. They reinstate Pali as pastor of the church, which they can't do under church polity or Hawaiian Kingdom law, neither one. But they say they do. They say, okay, he's the pastor again. And they excommunicate every member of the church who signed that petition. So in May of 1893, supposedly, the administration of the church, the ʻAhahui Hawaii, excommunicates 95% of the members of Waine'e Church. Now they say that's ridiculous, and they go down the street and they're still holding church at Kali Aloha, and but Pali's in control of the other church. They end up boarding it up and so forth. And there's a big fight. There's a law. There's people that go to jail and all kinds of things. But this was the type of reaction from Native Christians in the churches, was that no, this church is ours, this God is ours, and our nation is ours. Yeah, and you see that there's 13 different case studies I do in my book that talk about this type of thing in the different churches. In every case where the pastor preaches pro-annexation or pro-anti-monarchical rhetoric, they're booted out of the churches. So a really quick one here. This is from Kaumakapili Church. So at Kaumakapili, they started to ring the bell at 4:30 a.m. Actually, it says 4 and 4:30 to call church members down to the church to pray and fast for the restoration of the Queen. Now, this is a direct slap in the face of their administration, who have told them that the Queen is evil, that God is on their side, and so forth. Nonetheless, they do this. And it took me a little while to figure out why 4:30, and then finally hit me. Martial law was in place. You couldn't be on the streets from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. So the moment they could, Hawaiian Christians were coming down to Kaumakapili Church daily to pray for the restoration of their Queen, and they were fasting. Now, the English paper run by William Richards Castle comes out with an attack on them and says they shouldn't be doing this, and they're making too much noise, and they're waking people up in the morning, and so forth. And so they respond with this article, Haipulimau Kaumakapili, and I've translated a tiny bit of it. It says, the missionary newspaper reports to us it is not a good thing, these prayers to God in the highest heavens, indeed the one true God. We did it again today, and we will obey the voice of the bell calling the faithful of Hawaii. Rise and go inside this church of Jehovah, the one great God. Right? So there's no question in their minds who's behind this, right? It's the mission. And they say, they've told us what's good. They've told us that God's on their side, and they absolutely refuse to believe it. Now I want to mention this gentleman, William Abraham Kiha. I mentioned him a little earlier. He was one of the most prolific biblical analysts, if that's a word. He wrote quite a bit on different chapters of the Bible, what they meant to him. He was the Kahuvai Vaimua o Ecclesia o Kaumakapili. So he was the head deacon at Kaumakapili Church until Kaumakapili Church had the same issue. Their Reverend Waiamau, was also pro-annexation, and they fought to kick him out for over a year and a half. But in the midst of that, charges were brought against Kiha and against another deacon's wife for witchcraft. And so all of that consternation convinced Kiha to leave. He actually joined Ho'omanana'o Church, which is that split church, right? But he was the prime trustee. He was also the teacher of the independent school, the English language independent school at Kaumakapili. And he was the leader of the choir at Kawaiaha'o Church. And he wrote an introduction to this book that was an analysis of the beauty of the book of Genesis and what it means in the Bible. You know, so again, this idea of they're not just showing up at church. They're not just, playing Christian. On their own, they're teaching the Bible. They're analyzing the Bible. They're bringing it into their lives and so forth. And so all of this is more evidence of the fact that those arguments that the white Christian leaders of the church were making were completely false. So the thing about Abraham, though, is he also had no qualms about calling them out. And so he wrote several columns in the newspapers that I do put in my book, where he says some pretty staunch things about the mission sons, and I'll show you some of those. He writes a column in Kaleo Kalahui, 22nd November 1893, and he lists these things in a row. I'll read the English to you. He says, the knowledge of the Hawaiian people at this time regarding their faith in Holy Jehovah and in the Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit is sufficient for them to worship in truth and wisdom, right? So again, the administration, Emerson's, bishops, all these guys are going around town saying, well, Hawaiians they're not Christian enough. They're not good enough Christians. And he's saying that's ridiculous. He says next, long enough has been the time of being treated like babies under the hypocritical, lying leadership of the descendants of the missionaries as well as others. It's right there in black and white. This isn't my theory. Hawaiians are calling out the sons of the mission as being not Christian, as being hypocritical, as being lying. He says next, long enough, we have given our monthly offerings under their instruction and had these monthly funds turned over to the Hawaiian board. This is not something that anyone would be condemned for under the laws of God and the land. The withdrawal of individual churches from governance by deceitful liars to exist independently in enlightenment until the gospel of Christ is victorious in each of us in accordance with his wishes. So many of the churches around the islands have started to withhold their tithings to the main institution. They were keeping them in their congregations and keeping them in their localities. So he goes on to write some more. He writes here, the writer differentiates between the sons of the mission from their fathers, giving thanks to Binamu for bringing the torch of enlightenment of God's blessed word to Hawaii. He says around 1868, there was a change in the mission. And he writes almost 3 full pages about this evolution of the mission that started in the 60s. And it's kind of, punchline is this. He says, and in that year, 1887, and until this time, they and all their deeds have been exposed to the Lāhui as clearly as the sun at midday. Yeah, the nation, the Lāhui, the people, right? So again, no question about what Hawaiians knew, what they were aware of at this point. Finally, from Abraham, we get this. He says, I am fully assured about the troubles we have had from 1887 until now concerning our country and our beloved queen. This is a voice from God calling on all of his true devout believers throughout the islands, from the sincerely devout queen, Liliuokalani, down to her people. He is proclaiming to us, my people, with whom I have made a personal and eternal covenant, they have become like Isibaka, and the right in their leadership over you has passed, right? So he's saying this whole thing that's happening is a message from God that we as Native Christians need to stand up and claim our Christianity, which is part of that whole polity of the Congregationalist Church, right? So again, them not only being Christian, not only understanding what Christian was, but understanding the polity of it and understanding how ridiculous these accusations are being made. He says, the time has passed for listening to their deceitful, hypocritical, lying leadership that covets our consciousness, our land, our government, our authority, our resources, our jobs, our pride, our lives, our strength by their demonic pretense, etc. Rise, brethren, rise, deacons, take on your leadership roles at Kaumakapili and Kawaiahao. Overturn the pastors who were hypocrites, annexationists, rebels to the monarchy, rebels to the queen, rebels to the land, rebels to the Lāhui, rebels to the Hawaii's God, opposing his commandments. Love the queen, listen to the queen, heed the queen's requests to pray for the queen, right? So again, for Native Hawaiian Christians of this era, the question was about God and country, right? It wasn't about race. It wasn't about, they're not picking on the missionaries because they're white. They're rebutting and refusing the absurd accusations made by the minority white Christians in Hawaii and saying, we've got this, we understand this. William Richards Castle, mission son, I mentioned buying the papers. He was president of the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society and a major donor to the Papa Hawaii, the Hawaiian board. He was founder of Honolulu Rapid Transit Company, president of Honolulu Gas Company, co-founder of Eva Sugar Plantation. He was a trustee at Castle and Cook. So all of these involvements, all of these engagements this is all the motivation. This is just one man. I'm talking about the 30 or 40. This is the engagement and the motivation for them not wanting to hand over power. And they're masquerading behind religion. They're saying this is God's will. They're accusing Hawaiians of not understanding Christianity. He was also an officer in the Committee of 13, an annexation commissioner, president of the Board of Education, and the commissioner of public lands. He purchased the Hawaiian Gazette and the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. Okay. So we're finishing up. So I'm going to jump to 1901 now. The final presentation I'm going to do is going to bring us up to today through the 19th century. But to launch that, we have to understand what happened in 1901. After the overthrow in 1893, we have the supposed annexation in 1898 that we all know was illegal, but it's when America seized Hawaii. And one of the maybe good things that happened was by becoming part of the United States, now there's more democracy than there was in 1893 because the legislature is being voted on. And Hawaiians dominate that legislature. Because now everyone's getting to vote, except for Asians still. But in that 1900 vote for the first territorial legislature in Hawaii, the Home Rule Party that had started from scratch and in 6 months defeated the Republicans, defeated the Democrats, and they won that election. So they're controlling that first Native legislature. I spoke about this a little bit last week, but the narratives that come out about that legislature are horrible. And they're picked up by historians like Gavin Dawes and Ralph Kuykendall and others in the 20th century and show that up until recently, the story of that legislature was it was the worst legislature ever. They didn't get anything done. By diving into the actual record and pulling out the bills that were passed and pulling out those things, I was able to find that they did pass dozens and dozens and dozens of bills that were distinctly speaking to their constituency. They passed a bill taking all the tax off of any implements used to grow taro. They passed a bill making all the schools in Hawaii bilingual, teaching Hawaiian and English. They passed a bill bringing back Kalākaua's study abroad program for poor youth. They passed a bill reimbursing Chinese and Japanese who had lost their life savings in the Chinatown fire, even though they didn't have the vote. They had no political power, but Hawaiians knew it was the right thing to do, and so they passed that bill. And dozens and dozens and dozens of other bills like that, and Governor Dole vetoes almost every single one of them. And so out of that legislature comes very little progress, but it was because Dole had executive power and they were one vote short of a 2/3 majority. That's the story of the legislature. So when you read the Hawaiian language press about that legislature, there was an American newspaper man who came to cover it because it was a big story. This new territory of the United States is having their first legislature. And he wrote about how the decorum was amazing. One of the most smoothest running, efficient, political bodies he had seen, and so forth and so forth. He was very impressed that they were all wearing top hats and coats. But he wrote about this legislature in that way. But the men who were, again, a minority, desperate for power, and trying to hang on to power, wrote about it in a much different way, and I'll show you what that looked like. In William Richard Castle's Pacific Commercial Advertiser, they ran a cartoon about that first opening of the legislature. I'm sorry, it's the Gazette, this is the first one. So the Gazette's his paper also. So when the native-led legislature opened, he ran this cartoon. And it's literally says a Banderlog legislature, and it's got monkeys swinging from the jungle. Underneath it has the Jungle Book, and it talks about, Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, and it talks about they're all speaking in this monkey gibberish. There was a big fight about Hawaiian language in that legislature. The Organic Acts passed in 1900 had said that all the business, the legal business had to be done in English. But not only did they not want to, there were 9 of those 47 legislators who didn't speak English. They weren't fluent in English, they spoke Hawaiian, right? So of course they spoke in Hawaiian and they had a translator. And Dole sent somebody down to try to stop them from speaking Hawaiian, and it was a big struggle and fight. And so he's even referring that to here, that they're speaking this gibberish that nobody can understand. But it's this type of overt racism that is the one thing that's going to work for them, but what I think it does though is it shines the light pretty clearly, or very clearly, on again how that mission had changed. They're willing to go to this length, right? When the legislature closed in July, this cartoon came out from his other paper, Civic Commercial Advertiser, and it says the circus leaves town, and it's got the Hawaiian Simian Circus headed off to the woods, right? So really trying to speak to an American public about the fact that they say that Hawaiian Christians aren't capable. Okay, I want to read a final piece to you. Let me close my thing here. It's from the Queen's Hawaii Story by Hawaii's Queen, and I think many of you have heard it. But when I was working on this presentation over the last few days, it really kind of kept resounding in my head, and I thought, man, if I was Christian, this is a literal call to me, and how would I answer it? So at the end of her book, Hawaii Story by Hawaii's Queen, the Queen writes this. She has laid out the history, she's laid out her case, and she says, "Here, at least for the present, I rest my pen. During my stay in the capital, I suppose I must have met by name and by card at least 5,000 callers. For most of these, by word, by grasp of hand, or at least by expression of countenance, I have received a sympathy and encouragement of which I cannot write fully. Let it be understood that I have not failed to notice it, and to be not only flattered by its universality, but further very grateful that I have had the opportunity to know the real American people, quite distinct from those who have assumed this honored name when it suited their selfish ends. But for the Hawaiian people, for the 40,000 of my own race and blood, descendant of those who have welcomed the devoted and pious missionaries of 70 years ago, for them has this mission of mine accomplished anything. O honest Americans, as Christians, hear me for my downtrodden people. Their form of government is as dear to them as yours is precious to you. Quite as warmly as you love your country, so they love theirs. With all your goodly possessions, covering a territory so immense that there yet remains parts unexplored, possessing islands that, although near at hand, had to be neutral ground in time of war, do not covet the little vineyard of Naboth, so far from your shores, lest the punishment of Ahab fall upon you, if not in your day, in that of your children. For be not deceived, God is not mocked. The people to whom your fathers told of the living God and taught us to call Father, and whom the sons now seek to despoil and destroy, are crying aloud to him in their time of trouble, and he will keep his promise, and will listen to the voices of his Hawaiian children lamenting for their homes. It is for them that I would give the last drop of my blood. It is for them that I would spend, nay, am spending, everything belonging to me. Will it be in vain? It is for the American people and their representatives in Congress to answer these questions. As they deal with me and my people kindly, generously, and justly, so may the great ruler of all nations deal with the grand and glorious nation of the United States of America. So she quite eloquently says, it's not about hating Americans. It's not about hating white people. She's laying it out that it's this evilness that has taken hold. It's this greed, it's this selfishness, it's this racism, it's these things. And she asks them to stand up and stop it. And they don't at the time, right? We see this seizing of Hawaii anyway. But her call, I think, continues and asks us, what we will do about this history and this story. Yeah. So that's it for today.
Welcome, Ron, for that presentation. But to start, Kumaran, I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit about, you know, when they rang the bell at Kamakapili, like how long did that happen? How long were people in prayer and fasting? Were they gathering at that church?
Yeah, so it's in a chapter called Kani Ikapo, Resound in the Darkness, in my book, and it's one of my favorite pieces because Kamakapili Church is an important church today, right? It's a central church today, and it was at the time. Kawaiaha'o was the royal church, and folks, you know, went there, but Kamakapili was the church where everything happened. When they go to protest the Treaty of Reciprocity, when they go to push for these, they always gather at Kamakapili, and there was no question. I mean, it was the 19th. It was 2 days after the overthrow, and they had 43 deacons. There's a lot of people involved in the, you know, administration of the church, but there's no question what's going to happen there. I mean, they come together and they say, we're going to pray for the restoration of the Queen and for no annexation, and we're going to fast. The other interesting thing to think about in that scenario is that the white leaders of the church lived in that neighborhood, so they you know, I can only imagine that they were woken up, and it's difficult for them to deal with the fact that their congregations are rising up against them. It's a dangerous thing for them. But it goes on for approximately 2 weeks. Then there's a formal complaint made to the sheriff that it's causing noise and they need to shut it down and so forth. And the provisional government does shut it down. It lasts, I think, almost 3 weeks. It lasts a little longer at Waine'e Church in Lahaina. And I know it happened to other churches. I don't have documentation on it, but it was quite, you know, it was one of those things that was a way for them to show their devotion, right? Going to the church and waking up at 4 a.m. You know, we had a thing with Moani Keala Sitch. I'm not sure if you know, yeah. Well, you were part of it. We did a thing last year where and for me as a non-Christian, it was so moving because it's this commitment, right? That takes a little extra, you know, commitment and energy and so forth to just be in that space at that time and think about what happened and to praise those people who made that effort. So it's a really powerful incident for me.
Thank you. Okay, a question here. Why do you think the HCUCC church officers today are not able to apologize and begin reconciliation with Native Hawaiians to return land, money, stolen property?
Well, so the UCC did apologize in 1993. Part of my question in my dissertation and many other people's question was that enough? I mean, it was more than just an apology. They did put up money and so forth, but was that enough? Did we, and in my dissertation, when I started my dissertation, I went and talked to 2 of the members that were on that committee, that were on that board. And both of them spoke to me very honestly and said, we really had no idea what we were apologizing for. We just knew we did something wrong and we apologized. So yeah, so I can't speak to, I mean, I'm not a member of the HCUCC or the Congregation Chart, I'm not a Christian. So I can't really speak to motivations within the administration, all that stuff. But what I can say is I know that there's an academic question for me, is that so what happens now? There's a personal question for me as a human, but there's also a lot, there's a lot of talk in the community and so forth about what's going to happen next. So I don't know, but I do know it's an issue.
Okay, where can we get the names of the 400 plus members of the Secret Hawaiian League?
Good job. I have them. I'm trying to figure out how to get them to everybody. It's an Excel spreadsheet.
If you are able to share, I think if you get it to Kristen, that's something that can get to everybody.
Okay, we can do that. I'll send it to her.
Okay, great, thank you. So we will send that out. Okay. Let's see. During this time period, which churches participated in these outrageous doings? Protestants, Catholics, Mormons, evangelists?
You know, it was almost exclusively the American Protestants. There were several things, and looking at it analytically from my point of view, again, without any connection religious-wise, but looking at it analytically from my point of view, they weren't real smart about moving forward from 1863 because they stayed separated by race, which anybody could have told you was going to be a problem. And they talk about that. You know, there's in the American Protestant churches in Oahu, there's 10 native churches and 1 white church, Central Union. The Catholics went to church together. The Mormons were mostly Hawaiian. The Anglicans went to church together. You know, so the structure they set up, and it's not me guessing. It's in they say it themselves. It was about, for them, it was about miscegenation. It was about racism. They didn't want to mix with Hawaiians. So that you know, not to say that Anglicans and Catholics can't be racist, but their institutions simply were much more accommodating. And there's other issues. I mean, you know, Hawaii had been tied to the British in several ways for a long time. So the Anglican Church had that going for it. But it's really fascinating if you look at the reaction of those other churches, 93 to 98. They're all pretty vocal about the fact that, about calling out the American Protestant Church. So it's, you know, so again, I'm making a general statement, but it wasn't Christianity in general. It was the American Protestant Church in Hawaii.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone has asked, did the Roman Catholic Church have an agent in the islands, and what impacts did the doctrine of discovery have either on the Sons or in the Hawaiian Islands?
They did. And the doctrine of discovery had a lot of influence in Hawaii. Not so much on the ground level at those churches. I don't think that the ʻAhahui Hawaii, I don't think Thurston and those guys were thinking doctrine of discovery. I think they were thinking manifest destiny. And I would think, which is tied, similar, but I, you know, they simply, from 1863 on, they simply wanted to stay in Hawaii and they wanted to be in charge. As the mo'i go along, they keep pushing back and resisting and centralize, you know, pulling more power back into the monarchy. And these guys aren't like it. So it's a simple economic, racist, you know, push for power. And so, yeah, they're going to grab theories and stuff like that, but it's, you know, it's more about trying to stay in power.
Okay, someone has asked, how do we as a church effectively serve the disenfranchised people in Hawaii? That this should be the mission of the church now. I don't know if that's a question you can answer, but I'll put it.
No, that's a good question. I have no idea. I'm like, you know, okay, I'm not giving my thought. You know, I'm a bad Buddhist. You know, I try, but you know, I'm a human who I think has some sense of morality, and I think it's not that difficult. I really don't. I think the discussions are extremely complicated, you know, because you've got different constituencies and you've got different people that want different things. But in the end, you know, you ask yourself, how do we address this wrong and do right for people? You know, if we take into consideration that, and I've seen it in my classroom, if we take into consideration that generation after generation after generation of Native Hawaiian students was made to feel horrible about who they were, then go be a school teacher, or go start a project that helps, you know, kids in this neighborhood, or go, all of those things. You know, there's millions of things we can do to address in what I would guess is a Christian way, you know, these problems, these issues. It doesn't have to be a declaration it doesn't only have to be a declaration by the UCC or it can be each one of us acting differently in our lives to address something that's sitting there in front of us and we're ignoring.
Like that's seems to me like a very Christian response, actually, Ron. You know, what do we do in practice, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone asked, is Reverend Serrano Bishop related to the Kamehameha School's Bishop Estate?
No, different bishops.
Okay. Thank you.
I could pick on Charles Reed for a while if you want me to, but no, Sereno's worse.
Okay. How many of the sons were also either Knights of Pythias or Free and Associated Masons?
I don't know the answer to that. Some were. Kalākaua was. I'm not a big believer in Mason theories and the fact that had a lot to do with the takeover. You know, they were involved, and they did. It was important to a part of that socioeconomic thing. But I'm not a big. You know, I go by the record, and there's you know, I know it's a secret and so forth, but there's no record that shows that it had a direct impact on that was the significant motivation for a lot of these things. You know, it's and I'll follow up on that a little bit with Kalākaua. You know, there's people ask me all the time, you know, have you found evidence that Kalākaua was killed? And I absolutely believe he wasn't. You know, there's so many reasons why he wouldn't be killed. They had him over, they had bayonet over him. You know, they had him under control. You kill him and all of a sudden there's a new entity coming into place and you don't know what's going to happen. He was, by all accounts, very, very sick, and he led a very, very difficult life. I'm doing an article on his time in San Diego. When he died in San Francisco, but on that same trip, he went to San Diego and he did some amazing things. He went to Sweetwater Dam to check out the technology of the dam. He did some amazing things, but I also got a hold of literally his room bills for the Coronado Hotel, you know, and it's all, you know, champagne and booze and cognac and blah, blah. And I'm not, you know, but so, you know, it's for me, there's evidence that he died because he was very ill. And so, but some people, you know, say, well, the Masons killed him and da, da, da. And so I'm not discounting all of that, but I'm saying, you know, show me, let's get evidence.
Someone has asked, you teach to look that it was not the missionaries, but instead their sons. However, are they completely blameless? Didn't they have continuous communication and supported the sons?
So yeah, absolutely not. And someone had made a comment on Facebook, and I didn't want to answer because I don't want to get into a debate. But someone had mentioned the fact that you can't, that I was trying to separate the thing completely. Absolutely not. Like Brigham said, when they arrived in Hawaii, he said, "These naked and chattering savages, can they be human?" Like he was racist too. but there's a really incredibly important point, and that is going to institutional motivation and institutional direction. And so I believe, I mean, and believe me, I felt the opposite for 15 years. And I mentioned this before. When I went into this dissertation, my goal was to tear down the missionaries completely and to tear down the church and say, oh my God, I'm going to show in detail how awful and horrific these guys were. And I found this other story. And that was, those first guys that came were racist, like most people in the 1820s. Not to dismiss it, but I believe wholeheartedly that most of those missionaries came here because they thought they were doing something good to bring the gospel of Christ to Hawaii. And I know for a fact, if you go through the record of the Hawaiian mission houses, they lived a socialist life. They didn't, they shared 4 pounds of flour among the 20 of them, and they scrapped by, and so that was the mission. And then no question, the mission got bastardized by greed and power and stuff like that. And yes, they were in communication with their sons and so forth, obviously. But the sons did what they want. I mean, I have no question. I mean, again, I've been through thousands of pages. I have zero question that Artemis would have been horrified by what Sereno did. I have no question. I mean, well, my mom wasn't crazy about half the stuff I did. It's like, that's not an uncommon thing. I do, the record shows that the sons took it in a direction that the fathers would have been really unhappy with.
Thank you. There's a comment in here too. This is a campaign of genocide of the Kanaka Maoli people of Ko Hawaii ʻAina. Where did these Kanaka go? Native Hawaiians are Americans. This is the destruction of our country and people.
What was the question? Where did they go?
Where did they go? Yeah.
Oh, where did they go? Oh. Well, so as a historian, I can't answer it. It's an interpretation question politically. I have my opinions, my strong opinions. I'm a member of a couple of groups that work on these issues, but that's not why I'm here today. So I can't really answer politically. I can, if we're sitting having a beer one day, I'll tell you my political opinion. So yeah, as far as it's a big debate today whether or not to involve yourself at all in Hawaiian politics, in voting, in working with ʻOHA. There's a new committee that was named to look over Mauna Kea, and there's some incredibly wonderful people on there. But there's some folks that are saying you don't involve yourself with the state. So those are all good questions that should be discussed. I don't have an answer because it's just my opinion, and I don't really know a lot about that.
Thank you. Let me take these last 2 questions and then we'll wrap up for today.
Sure.
So could the first missionaries train their sons to become racist and white supremacist?
They could, but they didn't. I mean, and again, we're talking about terminology. By today's standards, every single one of them that came here was racist. Look at their writings and look at their actions in the look at the mission's actions 1820 to 1860, and they're blatantly different. And so yes, the first missionaries were racist, and that's an awful thing. Their sons got most of their, I don't think, there might have been some. I don't think there were very many at all, if there were some, early missionaries who said, one day we're going to take over this nation. I think they said, we're going to Christianize this nation. You know, I think the sons, because that's what, in the 1850s and 1860s in America, that was the thing. Manifest Destiny, Reverend Josiah Strong, his book was sold 200,000 copies. White men should run the world. You know, that's what everyone starts to come to believe in the 1850s and 60s who's white. So it's, yeah, so I just don't see it coming from the fathers. I see it coming from their education. I see it coming from their experience. And human greed. You know, they're making money and they like it.
Right. To what degree, if any, was there blowback on the continent, religious congregations or associations after what happened here with the churches?
There was blowback originally, like from Boston, and we talked a little bit about that. But Boston, you know, Reverend Rufus Anderson was horrified by what was going on, and he pushes back and pushes back and pushes back. The mission in the United States, though, you have to understand that ABCFM was a fundraising institution. They used Hawaii as a success story to raise funds for missions elsewhere in the earth. So they didn't want to really dig into, like, oh, but look at how it turned out, you know. So they just played with the, like, okay, we went there, Christianized them by 1860, and then look away, you know. But there was pushback in Christian groups. There was pushback during the overthrow. The Queen got a lot of support from different ministers and so forth in the United States.
Thank you. Well, I think there's a couple more questions, but maybe we can send them to you like we did last time. And if there's any you want to answer at the beginning of the next and final presentation, you can do that next time. But thank you, Kumuran, and I'll pass it to Linda again to wrap us up.
Thank you.
Once again, we're grateful to Ron Williams for his presentation and for all of the information that he shares with us, and for the opportunity to hear the actual words of the people who were there in that time. We will have one more session with Dr. Williams next week, same time, same place. And then we will move to talking about the land. So thank you for being with us again this week, and we hope to see you next week. Mahalo.
Aloha.
Aloha.